Last time, we followed Marius across his illegal consulships to his stronghold of Aquae Sextii in anticipation of a great battle against the German barbarians. Today, the Germans will oblige us and propel Marius to the pinnacle of Roman society. After his election as consul for the fourth time in 102 BCE, Marius returned to Gaul to await the great invasion. This time, the Germans emerged from Hispania. They appeared to be migrating their entire society into Italy. That's because they marched with their women, children, and domestic animals in their great baggage train. If they meant to turn to Italy, Marius reasoned, then we should meet them on their way in. To do this safely, Marius marched his forces to the far side of the Alps and prepared fortifications. These would be necessary to deal with the great number of Germans. Remember that these same Germans had destroyed multiple field armies at this point, and Marius was in no hurry to add his to the list. When the Germans finally did appear, their army covered most of the plain below Marius's fort. The German chiefs came before the walls of his camp and demanded that the Romans meet them in battle. But Marius was not at all interested in a fight. He simply shut the gates to his camp and ignored the Germans. This enraged the enemy chiefs, who took to abusing and hectoring the defenders for days. Marius's response was to force his soldiers to quietly take the abuse. Eventually, this strategy began to cause great consternation in the camp. Many of the Romans were eager to engage the enemy, but Marius reminded his soldiers that the stakes of this fight were the survival of Rome itself, and that they would only get one shot at this. Furthermore, Marius's delay was all a part of his overall strategy. He was using the impromptu German siege as an opportunity to accustom his men to the sight, equipment, movement, and habits of the fierce warriors. Forcing his soldiers into continuous guard duty was the best way to negate the psychological advantage that the Germans carried against the Romans. After all, they had scored repeated victories against previous Roman armies, and their strange, frightening appearance had something to do with it. Marius reasoned that when it was time for battle, the troops, thus inured, would not be afraid of their German foe. Quite to the contrary, they would be eager to pay them back. As for the Germans, eventually they became bored of the siege. At one point, they tried to storm the Roman fort, but were altogether unsuccessful in the attempt. Many were killed, and since they lacked any siege equipment, there wasn't much they could do to dislodge the Romans from their fortified camp. After this failure, the Germans concluded that perhaps Marius was not a real threat to them after all, and they elected to simply ignore the encampment and continue on their way. According to Plutarch, their number was so great that it took the Germans a full 6 days to pass by the fort. When the last of them had gone, Marius ordered his troops to strike the camp and pursue them. Wherever the Germans stopped, Marius either remade or reoccupied his own fortified camp just across from the enemy. This cat-and-mouse game continued for miles, until both armies settled just outside of Marius's original stronghold of Aquae Sextii. Marius struck camp there, just across from the Germans and just out of reach of the Durance River. When the men complained that their camp had no easy source of water, Marius pointed to the river and told them that they could find water there, but they would have to fight for it. He was right about that. The Germans had struck their camp just on the banks of the river. Before allowing the men to fetch any water, Marius ordered them to fortify their own camp. This led many soldiers to send their camp followers, either slaves or common-law wives, down to the riverside to bring back water. These few camp followers armed themselves with axes and entrenching tools and approached the river. There, they found the Germans bathing and eating their lunch. The lightly armed civilians took water until they were noticed by the Germans, who promptly struck and killed a few. After this brief skirmish, the barbarians raised an alarm and sent for their champions, the elite shock units who vanquished Caepio and Malleus at the disaster of Arausio. The Romans watched all this unfold in abject horror. Marius could restrain his men no longer, and allowed a detachment to attempt a rescue of the camp followers. This group, composed primarily of Ligurians, came to the river and exchanged war cries with the Germans before the fiercest tribe, the Ambrones, appeared on the opposite bank. Their savagery and aggression was their secret weapon, but also their downfall. When they saw only a small detachment of Romans, they must have been elated in anticipation of an easy victory. The Ambrones jumped into the river and attempted to ford it. Surely, they thought, this group of Romans would be as easily defeated as the last batch. But they were wrong. The Ambrones were still full and drunk from their lunch, and couldn't form into a cohesive formation on the opposite bank of the river. The Romans, hardened from their drill and training, stood on the high ground and waited as the champions emerged from the water one by one. The result was a massacre. Marius, observing the scene, quickly reinforced the first detachment. The Ambrones, in the midst of the river still, perceived their own danger and fled. There is no worse move in ancient warfare than for every man to run for his life. The Romans knew this and pressed their advantage, killing Germans all the way back up to their main camp. The deeper they pressed into the camp, the more unusual the sight became. There, they found that the German women had armed themselves and were attacking the fleeing Ambrones, apparently for treason. Now, the fiercest warriors of the German Confederation were caught in a pincer with the Romans on one side and their own wives and mothers on the other. The killing only came to an end with nightfall. The Romans spent much of that night fortifying their camp, expecting a massive retaliation at any moment for the day's battle. After all, the Romans were still quite outnumbered, and without a strong palisade wall, quite exposed to a massed attack. Marius refused to let his men rest until the camp was secure enough to withstand a protracted siege. But the counterattack never did come, neither that night nor the next day. At daybreak, Marius scouted the enemy camp. He found the Germans inconsolable, lamenting the deaths of their comrades. Only then did he let his men rest and give them double rations. But once they were refreshed, Marius ordered the attack. He deployed a force of about 1,000 men to the slopes overlooking the enemy camp and ordered them to lie in ambush until the battle commenced. Then he arrayed the rest of his forces in plain sight of the enemy for a frontal assault. The Germans, in their zeal for revenge, didn't wait for the Romans to descend onto even terrain, but instead ran haphazardly uphill to meet them. The Romans, taking advantage of this difference in slope, methodically pushed the Germans back downhill onto the flat plain, where they sprang their trap. What followed was another, worse disaster for the German tribes. Now caught in the Roman pincer, the Germans broke ranks again, which resulted in the slaughter or capture of the entire army. News of this incredible victory traveled back to Rome in short order, since, as Marius was still overseeing the division of spoils and conducting sacrifices of thanksgiving to the gods, Roman horsemen approached his camp with messages from the capital, saying that he had been elected consul yet again for the 4th consecutive year. The next set of messages that Marius received brought decidedly worse news. There was another major barbarian force threatening Italy from Noricum, much further to the east. While Marius was busy fighting the Ambrones, this other army of Cimbri crossed the Alps and defeated the army of his consular colleague for the year 102 BCE, 1 Quintus Lutatius Catulus. Now the Cimbri had full control of the entire Po River Valley and were devastating the lands there. For these reasons, Marius was recalled to Rome. When he arrived, he refused the triumph that the Senate had voted him. Instead, he briefly addressed the body and hurried back to the front with Catullus in tow. While Marius had been re-elected consul for the year 101 BCE, Catullus had not. This meant that he now held the lower rank of proconsul, most likely because of his failure to keep the Cimbri out of Italy. When the pair returned to the Po River, the Cimbri sent ambassadors to present their demands. Plutarch records Marius's meeting with the ambassadors. Caegar tus angelontas, equisonto denos, caeton Marion. For they sent to Marius demanding territory for themselves and their brethren, and enough cities for them to dwell in. When Marius asked their ambassadors whom they meant by their brethren, they said they meant the Teutones. At this, all the other Romans who heard them burst out laughing, and Marius mocked them, saying, "Then don't trouble yourself about your brethren, for they have land, and they will have it forever, land which we have given them." The ambassadors understood his sarcasm and fell to abusing him, declaring that he should be punished for it, by the Cimbri at once, and by the Teutones when they came. "Indeed," Marius said, "they are here, and it will not be right for you to go away before you have embraced your brethren." Saying this, he ordered the kings of the Teutones to be produced in chains, for they had been captured in the Alps, where they were fugitives. After this episode, the king of the Cimbri, Beorix, came to Marius and challenged him personally to battle. He named the time, in 3 days, and the place, the plain of Vercellae. The ensuing battle, just like the last one, was a disaster for the Germans. However, this battle was won as much by chance and due to the generally excellent condition of Catullus's soldiers and those of his legate and head of cavalry, Lucius Cornelius Sulla. There's that name again. Join me next time as Catullus, Sulla, and Marius all put their differences aside for the greater good of the Roman Republic. Just kidding. That would never happen. I'm Matt Lupu. Thanks for listening.